Jaehaerys the Conciliator is held up as one of the best, if not the best, Targaryen king of Westeros. His rule was a long one and rather peaceful when looking at the larger context of Westerosi history. His rule also saw massive improvements to the infrastructure of Westeros and to the lives of its people. The laws enacted and the projects started during his long rule would help make Westeros what it is today, and in many regards, Jaehaerys died, leaving the kingdom at its apex. As a result, he is regarded as legendary, held in the same esteem as the likes of Aegon the Conqueror himself. Now, I was watching Preston Jacobs and Red Team Review's Fire and Blood podcast, when Preston makes a very good point I often think about, and I believe gets overlooked when talking about Targaryen history and the narrative given to us in Fire and Blood and The World of Ice and Fire. What is important to understand is that both of these books are written as real, in-world history books. You may find at the Library of the Citadel. And like most history books, the information in them comes from a variety of different sources that the author pieces together to construct their factual narrative of history, and in cases where multiple sources contradict, deciding which of them is most likely closer to the truth. Like real history books, something that has to be looked at are the sources the author uses and their bias, as well as the author's own bias. The concept of history being written by the victors also has to be considered. As with real-world history, the side that wins a war often gets to dictate the narrative around it. So why do I think this is important to think about while talking about Jaehaerys? And why do I think the sources of information that make up the narrative of his reign should be scrutinized? The same way the sources that make up the narrative surrounding Maegor the Cruel's reign have to be scrutinized. Just like Maegor is made out to be this evil tyrant, which I think is mostly true, but I also believe he falls victim to the idea of history being written by the victors. The situation with Jaehaerys could very well be similar, albeit the other way around. One of the biggest, and if not the most important source of information when it comes to Jaehaerys is Septon Barth, who was sent to King's Landing to manage its libraries. Barth would befriend the young King Jaehaerys, becoming one of his closest advisors, and later Hand of the King. With Barth's position, it's no doubt he had inside knowledge about what happened, and for the most part, his account could be used to build up an idea of the narrative of events. But it is my view there is one glaring issue with Septon Barth's diaries and notes. It's clear from reading direct extracts from them, he injects his own opinion into events that in some cases can be read as fact. There is also the idea that his close relationship with the king could impact him being able to view events objectively. I think it's possible that Barth's view in some of the more controversial matters could be tainted by his bias in favour of the king, his friend. The faith was a key part of Jaehaerys' early reign, and a big part in the downfall of his father. It would be fair to say that the relationship between House Targaryen and the Starry Sept was fractured and risked spilling into another religious war. Jaehaerys, with the help of Barth, did a lot to repair the relationship. Documents such as the doctrine of exemptionalism would allow Targaryens to rule as they see fit, but find a way to placate the faith when it came to aspects such as incest and polygamy. It would have been vital for the faith for Jaehaerys to be seen in a good light, to maintain their position, power, and stability of Westeros. You could also question some of Barth's motives, and consider the idea he had been sent to King's Landing purposely to get close to the king, and influence governance and policy. I think it's fair that you consider some of these aspects when thinking about Barth as a source. Something I think is an interesting observation is the way Barth is presented in Fire and Blood. He always seems to be right in the view of Archmaester Gildain. His view or opinion is presented as the correct one. Even in the mind of Jaehaerys, in many cases it would seem he felt Barth is always right, hence why the king always sought his advice. The second type of source we have is the Grand Maesters who served Jaehaerys, such as Benefet and Ronceter. Many of these roles typically keep detailed accounts and diaries of what was happening at court, and like Septon Barth would have been privy to a lot of what happened behind closed doors. In comparison to Barth goes further. There is the Maester's own bias and perspective you need to take into account. If you believe the Grand Maester conspiracy theory, which I think has a lot of merit to it, with the power the Citadel and the Maesters have over lords, it means they can influence and manipulate what happens in Westeros. The Citadel being the sole real source of education and history keeping, this select group of men define what is the written and acknowledged history of Westeros. Their own views and bias can be intermixed with facts and evidence. In a way, history could be what the Citadel says it is. The mix of other sources come from accounts of many individuals of the time, from lords and knights to the testimonies of mad dwarfs. All would have their merits, but who is it that decides the validity of these accounts? Who is it that decides that these accounts should form the narrative of history. People like maesters, and in the case of Fire and Blood, a key source of Targaryen history in Westeros, and our key source in the real world. It is Archmaester Gyldayn. He chooses the sources he includes. He constructs the narrative of history given to the reader. So how does Jaehaerys fit into all of this? The way he's talked about and the way he's made out to be this perfect king is questionable. When you take a deep look at the events of Jaehaerys' life, many of his negative traits and instances where he could be seen as a true Targaryen seems to be brushed over or talked about in vague and brief terms, often being dismissed as speculation or rumour. Take for instance the events surrounding Corryan Wild and the in-world book A Caution for Young Girls. Archmaester Gyldayn makes it very clear that in his view these tales are nothing but hearsay, and the book A Caution for Young Girls akin to slander. In an old video I talked about whether Maegor the Cruel was really that cruel and deserved the title, and in it I came to the conclusion there is no doubt Maegor was a tyrant and did some very harsh and cruel things, but also that there are a lot of aspects of his life and his history that have been exaggerated in Fire and Blood that is not as black and white as Fire and Blood would make it seem. Maegor did have his good qualities, and some of the events that described clearly have some bias. It's a clear case, I think, of history being written by the victors. Does it take away from the kind of man Maegor was, or stop him deserving the title Maegor the Cruel? No, but it's not as simple as it first seems. In this case, I think the same ideas can be said for Jaehaerys, but in an opposite fashion, where the narrative constructed around him is there to maintain the idea of him being the perfect king, with the negative being played down. Almost the opposite of what could have happened to Maegor. Just like much of George R. R. Martin's work, nothing and no one is black and white. I want to explore this idea in the future. I really want to break down Jaehaerys' reign and pull out some key events in Jaehaerys' reign that could be questionable and fit into this idea of history being a constructed narrative. What I want to talk about in the comments in this video, which will help me inform later videos about this, is what elements of Jaehaerys' reign, or the reign of any other king, do you think could be almost like propaganda, that you think could be a constructed narrative, and where the text in Fire and Blood might not actually represent historical fact?